An unshakable rule states the relationship between spouses primarily concerns the two of them. In many ways, a family is akin to an independent state where the husband and wife establish their own laws and make their own decisions. Similarly, a family has boundaries that must be respected by both the spouses themselves and those around them. This story serves as a vivid reminder of what happens when others, even the closest ones, interfere in the life of a family. Joey Crouch and Chad Hattenbrunn were introduced to each other by mutual friends. Chad attracted Joey because he was unlike her previous boyfriends. He was older, had a good stable job. Chad, in turn, fell in love with Joey's sincerity and her open approach to life. The young couple quickly developed a relationship, and when the opportunity arose to take it to the next level, they didn't waste any time. They moved in together after just 1 year. So in the summer of 2000, the young couple lived in Weeki Wachee, Florida, and were trying to turn their house into a cozy nest. However, it wasn't easy because they were living in the home of Chad's younger brother, Troy. The brothers were very close and had a strong bond, but Troy clearly wasn't thrilled about Joey. Although she was pleasant to talk to and made an effort to befriend him, something about her irritated him from the very beginning. As it soon turned out, Troy wasn't the only family member who felt that way. After a few months of dating, it was time for the couple to introduce each other to their families. The meeting turned out to be rather awkward. Troy's unfriendliness was already known, but the attitude of Chad's parents, Brett and Patricia, surprised Joey's relatives. Chad's mother, Patricia, turned out to be an extremely shy person, so much so that it was nearly impossible to get a word out of her. Brett, on the other hand, was stern and domineering, unwavering in his beliefs. He was convinced that his word was law. Overall, the Crouch family was the complete opposite of the Hattenbrunn family. Naturally, Joey felt uncomfortable living with her boyfriend in his brother's house and dealing with the peculiarities of his parents. However, since she wanted to maintain her relationship with Chad, she knew she needed to win over his family. Joey was confident she could make it work, but it soon became clear that no matter what she did or how hard she tried to please Troy and Brett, they simply didn't like her. Just a few months into living together in Troy's house, Troy declared that he needed more personal space and demanded that Joey move out. Chad tried to convince his brother not to kick her out, but after a few months, he gave in. He told his girlfriend that she had to leave. It goes without saying that Joey felt hurt, insulted, and humiliated. She moved back in with her parents. Her best friend Sandy saw this as a red flag, believing that Chad should have stood up for her against his brother. Unfortunately, we don't know all the details, such as whether Chad and Joey contributed their share of the household expenses. Clearly, they should have been looking for a place of their own from the start. Perhaps Chad should have left his brother's house and found a home with Joey instead, especially since both of them were employed. Joey worked as a pharmacist, and Chad was a truck driver for a beverage company. Be that as it may, Joey moved back in with her parents, while Chad stayed with his brother. Only a few weeks later did he realize he had made a mistake. He went to Joey to ask for forgiveness and, as an apology, proposed to her. Joey had always dreamed of having a family, a husband, and children. She loved Chad and joyfully said yes. On November 5th, 2005, Joey and Chad's wedding ceremony took place. It seemed to be a long-awaited day for both of them. They were both happy and excited about their wedding. Joey, as always, was smiling and simply glowing. However, even on such a beautiful day, tension lingered in the air. The two families did not bond or unite as one. Chad's parents, Patricia and Brett, showed little interest in spending time with the bride's family. They kept their distance throughout the evening, which annoyed not only Joey and her family, but also friends who couldn't help but notice the strained atmosphere. This time, however, the source of tension and disapproval wasn't solely the Hattenbrunn family. Joey's brother Jeff, her father's son from his first marriage, was also a point of contention. Jeff was considered the black sheep of the family. He had been arrested over a dozen times, including charges of domestic violence. Every time he got into trouble, Jeff turned to their father for help, which annoyed Joey immensely. More significantly, Jeff had been implicated in 2 murder investigations. In one, he barely drew police interest, but in the other, he was a suspect. His ex-wife was found strangled on a deserted beach, and Jeff was suspected of her murder. Ultimately, the police dropped their suspicions. The charges were dismissed, and the case remained unsolved. However, it was unclear whether the authorities were convinced of his innocence or simply lacked evidence to prosecute him. Regardless, his relationship with Joey had deteriorated in recent years, though they had been very close as children. Perhaps he no longer felt like part of the family. Fortunately, despite the palpable tension in the air, Joey and Chad's wedding ceremony went off without any scandals. To safeguard their fragile marital happiness, Joey and Chad moved out of Troy's house in the summer of 2006 and into a home of their own. Naturally, Joey was thrilled that they would finally live alone together, but that was not the case. While her relatives never interfered in her relationship with her husband, the same could not be said for Chad's parents. Despite living in their own home, the Hattenbrunn family loomed over them like a shadow, monitoring every aspect of the couple's lives. In fact, Chad, Troy, and their parents' homes were all within walking distance of each other. Moreover, Chad's brothers and father had helped build the homes together. As a result, the young couple was never truly on their own. Brett, Chad's father, often dropped by unannounced, and worse, without knocking. Joey disliked this intrusion but tolerated Brett for the sake of keeping peace in the family. Asking Chad to set boundaries with his father was out of the question. Standing up to Brett, a domineering and authoritative figure, was something Chad simply couldn't handle. Joey's family disapproved of the situation. While they never imagined it would lead to anything serious, they firmly believed that no one should interfere in the life of a young couple. Keeping peace in the family became even more critical when, in 2007, Chad and Joey announced to their loved ones that they were expecting a child. Everyone was thrilled by the news, including Chad's parents, especially after it was revealed the couple was having a boy. However, with the birth of their son, the life of the young parents lost its idyllic glow. Both Chad and Joey deeply loved their son and genuinely cared for him, but the challenges of raising a newborn tested their marriage. They adjusted their work schedules to ensure someone was always home with the baby. When one returned from work, the other would leave. On the rare weekends when Chad could have spent time with his family, Brett demanded that he help with ongoing construction projects. As a result, Joey hardly ever saw her husband. She felt lonely, as though she had become a single mother. The constant absence of her spouse drove a wedge into their relationship. Chad became increasingly distant, spending most of his time either at work or with his father and brother. Joey's loneliness and the growing sense that she was no longer wanted by her husband eventually drove her to take a step she never would have imagined possible. In September 2011, when their son was 3 years old, Joey's despair reached its breaking point. She began communicating with a man online, someone who gave her the attention she had become unaccustomed to. Their conversations turned into something more, but as she told her friend Sandy, they only spoke on the phone and never met in person. Sandy suggested that Joey should honestly share her feelings with Chad, tell him about her fears that he no longer loved her the way he once did, and how she felt unwanted. However, Chad was already aware of her communication with the other man. He noticed that Joey had stopped putting her phone down. Taking the opportunity, he grabbed her phone and saw that she had been exchanging messages with someone. Joey assured him that they were just talking, but this did little to reassure Chad. Feeling unsettled, he decided to seek support from the last person he would have expected, his father, Brett. Brett, who had never been particularly fond of his daughter-in-law, coldly remarked that this was exactly what he had expected from Joey. On September 16, 2011, Troy hosted a small gathering at his house with 6 or 7 friends. While Joey was at work, Chad and their son stopped by Troy's place. There, Chad unexpectedly learned that everyone knew about his family problems. However, if he was expecting support from his relatives, he was looking in the wrong place. Troy mockingly asked him what he was planning to do about his unfaithful wife. At 11:30 p.m., Chad went home because it was time to put their son to bed. A friend drove them back. As Chad got out of the car in front of his house, he heard a wheezing sound. At first, he didn't realize that it was Joey lying on the street in front of their home. It was her gasping for air. She was severely injured, with blood on her face, head, and hair. Every breath she took was more difficult than the last. Chad's friend immediately took their 3-year-old son away from the horrifying scene and called 911. He explained to the police that something terrible had happened to Joey. She was covered in blood and struggling to breathe. While his friend was on the phone with the police, Chad called Joey's mother and his own father. He couldn't tell them what had happened because he didn't know the full extent himself, but he wanted them to come as soon as possible. Police and paramedics arrived just a few minutes after the call. An ambulance rushed Joey to the hospital. She was still clinging to life. The doctors reported that Joey had suffered a severe head injury caused by a blow with some heavy object. In other words, she had been brutally beaten and her life hung by a thread. The entire family prayed for her, hoping that she would recover, but that didn't happen. The next morning, the severity of the injuries left her with no chance of survival. Her mother, Carolyn Crouch, and her husband, Chad, made the decision to withdraw her from life support. None of her family members had the strength to witness her in such a state, and when she passed away in the hospital, no one was by her side. She died surrounded only by medical staff at the age of 30. After conducting the autopsy, the forensic expert confirmed the conclusion that Joey had been beaten. The killer had inflicted over 10 blows to the back of her head, leaving her with virtually no chance of survival. Based on the nature of the injuries, the police suspected that the crime had been committed by someone who knew Joey and was likely enraged, possibly acting in a state of emotional distress. As usual, the investigation began with questioning family members, friends, and neighbors of the victim. Joey's close friend Sandy recalled a conversation with Chad that took place just a week before Joey's murder. Chad had approached her on the street, looking very upset. He claimed that Joey was cheating on him and asked Sandy to tell him what she knew. Sandy was unaware that Joey had already confided in him, so she replied that she didn't know anything about it. However, Chad's response did not calm down, and he became furious. When the investigators learned about this, they immediately focused on Chad. They asked Troy whether he could confirm his brother's alibi. Troy stated that he and Chad had been together the entire evening and that they hadn't gone anywhere. However, since Troy and Chad were brothers, the investigators were unsure if they could trust their statements, as they might be covering for each other. The brothers were asked to undergo a stress analyzer test, one of the types of lie detector tests. Troy's test showed that he was telling the truth. After this, the investigators shifted their focus from Chad's family to one of Joey's relatives, her half-brother Jeff. Chad told the police that Joey did not get along with her brother. They had communicated well during childhood, but over time, something had changed. The young man constantly got into trouble, and whenever it happened, he would rush to his father for help. 5 years ago, during a family Thanksgiving dinner, Joey's brother lost control, went off the rails, and ruined the celebration for everyone. Joey had stood up for her relatives, demanding that he calm down. In response, he said, "You know, you're on my list." The statement sounded threatening. It is unknown how Joey took it, but her husband prohibited her from seeing her brother and kept their young son from having contact with him. The detectives traveled to the neighboring district where Joey's brother lived. Jeff behaved openly, spoke candidly with the detectives, and provided a detailed account of what he had been doing that evening. He did not appear suspicious. The investigators realized that he was not involved in the crime and knew nothing about his sister's life or what she had been doing. Despite their differences, he loved her and was deeply angry and saddened by her death. He was quickly removed from the list of suspects. Returning to the starting point of their investigation without any new leads, the detectives pondered who might have wanted to settle scores with Joey. They had already spoken to all her relatives and close friends, and all of them were eager to help with the investigation. At this point, the detectives realized they had not paid enough attention to Brett, Chad, and Troy's father, the powerful and stern head of the Hattenbrand clan, who, according to Joey's relatives and friends, wasn't particularly warm towards his daughter-in-law. While the detectives didn't suspect the man of anything, they invited him for questioning to cover all their bases. It was possible that he had a reason for disliking Joey, and it would be helpful to learn about it. Brett claimed that he had spent the entire evening at home. He said that late at night, Chad called him to say that something had happened to Joey and asked him to come over. Brett quickly threw on the first clothes he found and drove to his son's house. By the time he arrived, the police were already working at the crime scene. However, the neighbors told a different story. They had seen Brett near the house of Chad and Joey shortly before the murder. When the detectives confronted Brett with this information, his testimony changed. He now remembered that he had gone outside that evening and noticed a strange car parked near his son's house with its headlights on. According to him, he grabbed his rifle, got into his car, and drove toward the suspicious vehicle. He claimed that he scared the driver away, who then drove off. The detectives might have believed him if he had said, for example, that he had gone to a store and simply forgotten the details after all the shocking events. But forgetting about seeing a suspicious car so close to the time of his daughter-in-law's murder, they found this hard to believe. The detectives were certain that Brett was fabricating a possible scenario to explain his presence near Joey's house that night. While Brett was very inventive with his story, it didn't save him. He became the prime suspect in the police investigation. They asked him to undergo a polygraph test, and he failed. The detectives' suspicions grew, but there was still not enough evidence to make an arrest. The detectives attempted to gain Chad's support. They openly told him that they suspected Brett of the murder. Chad didn't deny that his father had a difficult character and could sometimes have outbursts of uncontrollable anger, but he was convinced that Brett would never have gone so far as to kill his daughter-in-law. However, Chad agreed to call his father and try to talk to him. The detective turned on the recorder and Chad dialed Brett's number. He started by asking Brett about the suspicious car he had seen near Chad's house. Brett explained that he hadn't mentioned it earlier because he had resolved the issue on his own. Chad then asked why Brett had failed the polygraph test. Brett responded that he had been beaten by the police, which caused his mind to become clouded. Chad couldn't hold back any longer and directly asked his father to tell him the truth if he had killed his wife. He tried to appeal to Brett's emotions, but Brett didn't fall for the bait and continued to deny everything. There was still hope to find compromising evidence in the suspect's home. The detectives obtained a warrant to search Brett's house. When they knocked on the door, Brett cracked it open just slightly, but enough to throw a Molotov cocktail at the detective's feet. After that, he flung the door wide open and fired at the police. Not with a firearm, but with a pneumatic hammer connected to an air compressor. The large nails shooting out under 9 atmospheres of pressure were as dangerous as bullets. One of the officers returned fire and shot Brett in the abdomen. He was taken to the hospital where he received medical attention. His injury turned out to be non-life-threatening and not serious. On September 27, 2011, 11 days after Joey's murder, detectives interrogated Brett again. He continued to deny any involvement, but how could he explain his attack on the police? After 7 hours of questioning, he finally confessed. Brett had never had particularly affectionate feelings for his daughter-in-law, considering her a pampered princess. He did not hide the fact that he would have preferred a different wife for his son. However, he endured her presence for 11 years. But when his son told him that Joey was seeing another man, Brett became enraged. His fury built up inside him, and he couldn't calm down. Of course, he had been invited to the party at Troy's house, but he had declined the invitation, not wanting to meet with Joey. On the night of September 16, 2011, Joey returned home from work, where Brett was waiting for her. She was shocked to see her father-in-law as she got out of her car. Brett immediately got to the point and asked if she was seeing another man. Joey probably thought it unnecessary to answer such a question. She was holding her phone in her hands, which infuriated Brett even more. In the bed of his pickup truck lay a piece of pipe. Brett grabbed it and ordered her to drop the phone. When she didn't let go, he struck her arms with the pipe. When Joey screamed from the pain, Brett covered her mouth with his hand. After she shoved his hand away, she screamed again. Brett ordered her to be silent and began beating her with the pipe. When she fell to the ground, he took her purse and emptied its contents. He also took her wedding ring. He thought that by taking her valuables, he could stage it as a robbery. Then, realizing that the police were getting closer to him, he opened fire on the officers with the pneumatic hammer, hoping they would kill him. Based on the interrogation results, Brett was charged with the murder of his daughter-in-law. The trial began in 2014. Brett unexpectedly began to claim again that he would never have harmed his daughter-in-law. He said the police had coerced a confession from him. However, the jury did not believe his words. On March 25, 2014, 63-year-old Brett was found guilty of second-degree murder and 9 other serious crimes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder and an additional 105 years for 6 counts of charges, including assaulting police officers. Joey's mother, Carolyn Crouch, stated that she would never forgive or forget what he had done. She told her daughter's killer that no one would miss him. 4 years later, Brett died in prison from natural causes. Investigators concluded that Chad, Troy, and their mother Patricia had no connection to Joey's murder. Although it's hard to dismiss the persistent question, if Chad hadn't aired his family's dirty laundry and told his father about their marital troubles, perhaps Joey would still be alive today. After all, Brett had tolerated his son's choice for 11 years. The girl had given him a grandson whom he loved unconditionally. If the young family had been able to set boundaries in time, they could have reconciled, lived happily, and raised their son. Headaches were frequent visitors in the home of Susan Snow from Auburn, Washington. By now, they no longer surprised her, nor did they seriously worry the 40-year-old. Susan worked as an assistant to the vice president at Puget Sound National Bank. Over the years, many clients had gotten to know her personally, respected her for her professionalism and kindness, and often requested that only she handle their accounts. But her success and popularity didn't ease the stress and pressure that came with the job. The headaches came often, though not badly enough to justify taking sick leave. Instead, Susan simply took a few tablets of over-the-counter Excedrin Extra Strength. Susan felt yet another annoying headache as she woke up on the morning of June 11, 1986. Shaking a couple of red gelatin-coated capsules out of the bottle, she swallowed them and placed the bottle back into the cabinet above the kitchen sink. The powerful medication usually eased her headaches within 15 minutes. In the meantime, she could wash up and change into her business suit. Susan's 15-year-old daughter, Haley, was also up and taking a shower before school. That morning, only Susan and Haley were at home. Susan's husband, 45-year-old Paul Webb King, was a long-haul truck driver and had already left for work. Her older daughter, 23-year-old Exer, had spent the night in the city. Haley could hear the muffled sound of running water through the bathroom wall. It was coming from her mother's room, where Susan was finishing getting ready for work. Suddenly, Haley flinched at the sound of a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen. She figured her mom might have tripped and fallen. Listening closely but hearing nothing else, she shrugged it off, assuming she was overreacting and that maybe a heavy bottle or something similar had simply dropped. After her shower, Haley was putting on makeup in front of the mirror when she realized the water was still running. Something felt wrong. She walked into her mother and stepfather's bedroom, but Susan wasn't there. The sound of rushing water still came from the bathroom. Haley called out to her mom. No answer. She peeked inside. The sink was nearly overflowing. Any more and water would have started spilling onto the floor. Susan couldn't turn it off. She was lying on her back at the base of the sink, her head awkwardly propped against the frame of the shower stall. Her eyes were wide open, fixed in place. Her skin looked unnaturally pale and tense, her face frozen in a mask of terror. She was gasping for air, like she was suffocating. Haley had never seen her mother like this. Panicked, she rushed over and tried to lift her, but Susan didn't respond. At 6:43 a.m., Haley called emergency services, and by 7 o'clock, paramedics had already arrived at the house. She assumed her mother had fallen. The medical team also initially believed Susan had hit her head, but there were no visible injuries. No cuts, bruises, swelling, or fractures. A curling iron lay near the sink, which Susan had been using, but electrocution seemed unlikely. There were no burn marks, and a shock strong enough to cause this kind of collapse would have tripped the circuit. The paramedics began checking medication bottles for signs of overdose, accidental or otherwise. But Haley was quick to explain that her mother wasn't depressed and would never harm herself. She didn't use illegal substances either. Haley mentioned that her mother had woken up with one of her usual headaches and had taken some painkillers. She brought the bottle of Excedrin from the kitchen. It contained 60 capsules originally, and only a few were missing. Susan couldn't have taken too many, and given how often she used the medication, a bad reaction seemed unlikely. With no clear understanding of what was wrong, the doctors did everything they could to help Susan, but her breathing grew more labored and her pulse weakened rapidly. A helicopter was dispatched to airlift her to a medical center. Since Susan had no history of serious health issues, doctors suspected her recurring headaches might have been signs of an undiagnosed condition, like a stroke or an aneurysm. However, none of her symptoms fully aligned with any known diagnosis. The medical team was confused and unsure how to treat her. Meanwhile, Susan's condition was deteriorating by the second. Her loved ones, husband Paul, her second ex-husband Connie Snow, with whom she remained on friendly terms, her twin sister Sarah, and her older daughter Exer, were all notified of Susan's hospitalization. At first, none of them were overly concerned. Susan had always seemed healthy and rarely complained about her well-being, so the idea of something serious didn't cross their minds. But as they arrived at the hospital one by one, they were horrified by what they saw. Susan had slipped into a coma, and machines were the only thing keeping her alive. Doctors confirmed brain death and delivered the heartbreaking news that there was no hope for recovery. By midday, Susan Snow was gone, a seemingly healthy woman taken in a matter of hours by an unknown force. What exactly caused Susan's sudden death remained a medical mystery. Hoping for answers, her family agreed to an autopsy. At the morgue, as the pathologist made the first incision to open the chest cavity, her assistant caught a distinct smell rising from the body, the bitter scent of almonds. The assistant immediately recognized it as the telltale sign of cyanide poisoning and reported it to the pathologist. However, the pathologist couldn't detect the scent. Soon after, Susan's attending physician entered the room, also eager to learn the cause of death, and he didn't smell it either. In addition, Susan's skin was unusually pale. While cyanide victims typically show pink or bright red coloring, the assistant hesitated to press the issue, but insisted the pathologist send a blood sample for cyanide testing, a procedure not normally done during a standard autopsy. The medical examiner agreed, though she remained convinced Susan had died from natural causes, possibly cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat that, in severe cases, can cause stroke or heart failure. But to everyone's astonishment, cyanide was found in Susan's system. The pathologist and doctor hadn't noticed it because the ability to detect the smell of cyanide is genetic. 20 to 40% of people simply lack the gene required to sense it. Had the assistant not been present during the autopsy, the cyanide that killed Susan likely would have gone undetected. In fact, her symptoms aligned perfectly with cyanide poisoning. The toxin prevents cells from absorbing oxygen, effectively suffocating the body from within. Deprived of oxygen, cells quickly begin to die, leading to dizziness, shortness of breath, coma, and, in lethal doses, cardiac arrest. Susan's fall, labored breathing, and rapid decline into unconsciousness all fit this pattern. The only anomaly was her pale skin. Cyanide victims often appear pink or red, but this isn't always the case. The pathologist informed Susan's family and the police. The cause of death was acute cyanide poisoning. It's a rare form of poisoning, most often caused by inhaling smoke during house or industrial fires. Cyanide is also found in metalwork, jewelry production, photography, pest control, and agriculture. None of these applied to Susan, nor could she have accidentally ingested a fatal amount. While trace amounts exist in certain seeds or fruits, an adult would have to consume hundreds, if not thousands, for it to be lethal. Intentional ingestion was also unlikely. Her family firmly denied any signs of depression, and Susan had clearly been preparing for a regular workday. In cases of suicide by cyanide, it's usually committed by people with lab or medical access. Susan wasn't one of them. Police arrived at her home and seized anything that could possibly contain cyanide: pesticides, chemicals, and especially the bottle of Excedrin capsules. Detectives still remembered the horror of the Chicago Tylenol murders 4 years earlier, when an unknown pharmaceutical terrorist laced capsules with cyanide, killing 7. By that evening, tests on Susan's Excedrin were complete. Of the original 60 capsules, 56 remained. 9 of them contained 4 times the lethal dose of cyanide. There were no fingerprints on the pills, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual, Susan's husband, Paul Webb King, had suspected the Excedrin long before anyone else. During the autopsy, Paul had a phone conversation with the pathologist. They discussed various possible causes of death, all of which Paul dismissed. Then, almost out of nowhere, he asked whether his wife could have died from poisoned capsules. The question caught the doctor off guard. Paul explained that Susan had taken Excedrin right before her collapse, specifically from a newly opened bottle of capsules. At the time, the pathologist brushed the idea aside, thinking it was far-fetched. But once cyanide was actually discovered in the capsules, Paul's oddly specific suspicion raised red flags. Paul claimed that earlier that morning, before leaving for work, he too had taken a dose from the same bottle to ease his arthritis symptoms. No one had witnessed this, and there were just enough missing capsules to suggest he might have taken some, or that he simply removed a few to support his story. Had Paul been unbelievably lucky to avoid death, or had he known the pills were poisoned? Detectives began to suspect the latter. Further doubts came from Susan's identical twin sister, Sarah. Like Susan, she suffered from frequent headaches, and both sisters preferred buying their painkillers in tablet form, not capsules. After the infamous Tylenol murders in Chicago, they believed tablets were harder to tamper with. So when Sarah saw a bottle of capsule-form Excedrin in her sister's home, she was shocked. She brought it up to Paul. He claimed Susan had accidentally bought capsules instead of tablets, but later discovered she preferred them. They were easier to swallow. Sarah wasn't convinced. Something about his explanation didn't sit right. Taking these facts into account, it's no surprise that the detectives began to look at Paul as a suspect, especially since the search for other possible suspects, such as the bank's clients, Susan's ex-husbands, or lovers, yielded no results. The investigators themselves noted that Paul's character lacked positive traits, and he spoke about his late wife without emotion. He made crude jokes that made others feel uncomfortable given the situation. The only time he showed any emotion was when his face flushed with anger upon realizing he was being considered a suspect. Those who knew him described him as a jealous, possessive man who only cared that his wife earned more than he did. When Paul was asked about the marriage, he said that he and his wife got along perfectly and hadn't argued since September 1985. He remembered the date precisely because that was when he confessed to being unfaithful. During a business trip, he had an affair with an ex-girlfriend named Mary. Paul claimed that after seeing a psychologist, he and Sue reconciled, and in the following months surprised everyone by announcing their engagement. They exchanged vows on Thanksgiving Day, 1985, about 7 months before Sue's death. But although Paul insisted they were getting along well, others might dispute that claim. The husband's infidelity was all Susan talked about. She kept a photo of Mary in a kitchen cabinet and even once showed the picture to her younger daughter saying, "Look at this bitch." In her notebook she wrote, "To hell with Paul. I hate Mary. I hate Paul." She thought about kicking her husband out, but couldn't bring herself to do it. The thought of losing him devastated her. It was the late Susan who was the glue holding the family together. With her gone, the family split into two factions. On one side was Paul, on the other were everyone else. From a practical standpoint, Paul wasn't the only one who could have administered the poison. As Paul rightly told Haley, she should prepare herself because she was alone with her mother at the time of death and would become the prime suspect. But it wasn't only Haley who was scared. The older daughter, Exeter, was also in town and even stopped by her mother's house the evening before her death to pick up some things. She did not stay overnight at her mother's house, but stayed at a hotel with a friend Susan couldn't stand. Right after her mother's death, Exeter gave a statement, but when asked to come to the station a second time, she showed up with a lawyer, then left after a minute and refused to speak to the police. The detectives understood that every member of Susan's family had the opportunity to poison her. They all had access to the house and no one would have aroused suspicion being in the kitchen, but only one person stood to gain financially from Sue's death. She was insured for $20,000, which Paul would have received. The man claimed he would use part of the sum to pay off credit card bills, with the remainder going to Sue's daughters. However, the girls didn't receive a single cent. When they asked him about the promised money, he replied that finances were tight. The daughters also noticed that their mother's jewelry had gone missing. Paul himself was changing before their eyes. He swapped his usual Hawaiian shirts for expensive business attire and bought a new car. He also started seeing another woman. It was as if he didn't care that his behavior was making him look more and more suspicious. Meanwhile, news about the poison capsules, of course, reached Bristol Myers Squibb, the manufacturer of Excedrin, and rumors began circulating about a copycat poisoner from Chicago. However, the police were convinced that Susan's murder was an isolated incident committed by someone she knew. Nevertheless, unwilling to take any chances, Bristol Myers recalled the capsule products nationwide. This decision cost them millions, possibly tens of millions of dollars. The product recall became sensational news. The media loudly covered Susan's murder. Customers returned Excedrin to pharmacies, and staff removed it from the shelves. All the bottles were sent for laboratory analysis, despite the police's confidence that this was a waste of time. But everything changed on June 17th when the police received a call. The woman on the line was hysterical. She spoke incoherently but managed to explain that she noticed similarities between Susan's murder, which had been in the news, and the death of her husband a week earlier. 6 days before Sue's death, on June 5, 1986, 52-year-old Bruce Nickel returned home from his job at the State Department of Transportation, where he worked as a heavy equipment operator. He arrived at 4:10 p.m. His beloved wife, 43-year-old Stella, was preparing dinner. Due to working with heavy equipment, Bruce often suffered from headaches. This day was no exception. He hoped a shower would refresh him, but the headache wouldn't simply go away, so he resorted to his usual remedy, a strong dose of Excedrin. The recommended dose was 2 capsules, but Bruce decided the medicine would work faster and be more effective if he took 4. All he had to do now was wait. Bruce went out to the backyard, where he breathed in the fresh air and admired the peaceful surroundings. After a few minutes, Stella was startled when her husband called out to her in a strange way. She found Bruce leaning against the patio doorframe. He was dizzy and on the verge of fainting. Stella helped him to the couch. Bruce tried to sit, but his legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the floor. At 5:02 p.m., Stella called emergency services and reported that her husband was having some kind of seizure. Paramedics found Bruce lying on the living room floor, unresponsive. He was gasping for air. What also disturbed the medics was the color of his skin. His body was pale, except for his head, where the skin had turned bright red. They had never seen anything like it and didn't know what it meant. While the medics attempted to revive Bruce, Stella explained that her husband was a recovering alcoholic and a heavy smoker. But considering this, he was generally quite healthy. He was not prone to anxiety attacks, fainting, or seizures. From time to time, he experienced headaches, including the one he had that day. Stella brought the painkiller package from the kitchen. The medics quickly examined it and ruled out the medicine as the cause of Bruce's condition. It was just Excedrin, which Bruce regularly took without problems. Time was critical. The man's blood pressure was dropping, and efforts to stabilize him failed. A helicopter transported him to the medical center, but despite the doctor's efforts, he died by midnight. Bruce Nickel was an adopted child. At 16, he accidentally overheard a conversation and learned the truth. Although he loved his adoptive parents deeply and was endlessly grateful to them, he was haunted by the thought that his biological mother had abandoned him. This led to trust issues that contributed to 3 failed marriages, as well as a serious alcohol addiction, which he used to numb his pain. At the same time, he was a very intelligent man, gentle, sensitive, and with a great sense of humor. But by the time he was well into his 40s, he was still hopping from bar to bar until he either passed out or got thrown out, whichever happened first. One evening at a tavern, he met an elegant, dark-haired beauty he had never seen before in town. Her name was Stella, and she didn't seem like the kind of woman someone like Bruce would attract. However, like Bruce, Stella carried her own scars, both emotional and physical. Stella was born in Oregon, but remembered little of her childhood because one time her father, drunk again, kicked her mother, brothers, and sisters out of the house, shooting at them with a shotgun. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but that was the last straw for Stella's mother. She took the children and moved to Colorado. Then came 2 terrible fires. After the first, Stella needed a skin graft. The second fire resulted in the death of her little brother. At 15, Stella realized she was pregnant and confessed to her family that it was the result of abuse. On October 23, 1959, she gave birth to a girl, Cindy. Another pregnancy came when Stella was 18, but she gave that child up for adoption. She often changed relationships, homes, and jobs. Over the years, Stella built an emotional armor around herself. Those who weren't close to her found her cold, distant, and withdrawn. But those who managed to break through found warmth, humor, and passion. Her first meeting with Bruce left little impression on Stella, but a week later she ran into him on the street and saw him in a different light. He seemed smart and attractive to her. Even his alcoholism didn't repel her. She accepted it. Strange as it may sound, their romance blossomed in bars, where they spent evenings playing pool and drinking. Every weekend they enjoyed wild parties. They got married in September 1976, but within a year they faced financial difficulties, largely due to Bruce's habit of spending $250 a week on alcohol, a significant amount even by today's standards. Although they both enjoyed their alcohol-fueled lifestyle, Stella encouraged her husband to cut back on drinking, or at least drink at home, which would be safer and cheaper. But Bruce found it hard to change until one moment. In 1979, he went on a 2-week binge, missing work and rarely coming home. When Stella found him in a bar, something seemed to click in his mind. He enrolled in an addiction treatment program. Over 10 days, he underwent aversion therapy, commonly known as coding, completed the program on the 10th day, and from that moment on, Bruce never took another sip of alcohol. However, Bruce couldn't give up another bad habit. He was a heavy smoker. During the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that the man died of hypertension due to cardiopulmonary collapse caused by emphysema of the lungs. But his wife simply couldn't accept this. Her husband was healthy. Bruce had recently undergone a medical exam for work. The doctors had warned that he might develop emphysema in the future, but they had seen no signs of it at the time. Stella wondered if a lung disease could progress so quickly and fatally. Nevertheless, from a medical standpoint, the case was closed. Bruce was buried. And a week later, Susan Snow's murder made headlines everywhere. After Stella's call to the police, an officer arrived at her home. Stella opened the door. The widowed woman looked absolutely terrible. Stella had become seriously addicted to alcohol. Friends worried she would drink herself to death. Her house had turned into a dump. Even her once bright and colorful tropical fish aquariums, a source of pride, showed signs of neglect. Stella worked as a security inspector at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She monitored X-ray machines, checking travelers' luggage before flights. She had risen to a supervisory position due to the seriousness with which she approached her job, but since her husband's death, she spent nights in bars and showed up to work in the morning, smelling strongly of alcohol. At the officer's request, Stella brought the medication Bruce had taken before his death. The bottle was almost empty, only 8 capsules remained. Stella also handed over a second bottle, still sealed in its packaging. She had purchased them at different locations about 2 weeks apart. Stella believed she bought the first bottle somewhere in Auburn and the second in Kent. Both bottles were sent for testing. Poison capsules were found in both bottles of Excedrin from the family's home. Bruce had already been buried, but a vial of his blood, taken during the autopsy, was kept at the King County Medical Examiner's office. When the police requested it be analyzed, poison was detected. Bruce had died from cyanide poisoning, So 2 people had died from acute cyanide poisoning. Yet Bruce and Susan were strangers to each other. They had nothing in common except that they both lived in Auburn, Washington. The news of the second poisoning spread fear. Investigators once again shifted the focus of the investigation. This time they were searching for a serial killer. At that point, only 2 victims were known, but the police feared there might be more. The product recall continued, and Bristol-Myers faced immeasurable damage. Paul Webb King and Stella Nickel filed lawsuits against the company. Paul expressed frustration with how the police were handling the investigation. He felt the investigators were wasting time on him when they should be looking for the real killer. Surprisingly, 3 of Paul's ex-wives came to his defense. They insisted he was not a wife killer, just someone who divorced if something in the relationship stopped working for him. Finally, when Paul passed a polygraph test, meanwhile, Bristol-Myers recalled 15,000 packages of Excedrin. And out of those 15,000, only 1 contained cyanide. The bottle was taken from the same store in Kent where Stella Nickel had bought the medication. After examining Bristol-Myers manufacturing facilities, the police concluded that cyanide could not have entered the capsules during production. Moreover, the poisoned bottles had only appeared so far in King County, Washington. Investigators narrowed their search to the store in Kent, questioning staff about disgruntled former employees or customers acting suspiciously. Then, on June 24th, another extraordinary event occurred. A bottle of maximum-strength Anisin 3, placed on top of a jar of peanuts 2 rows away from the medicine aisle, was out of place. Given the circumstances in the city, the manager handed the medication over to the FBI, and it was found that 4 capsules contained cyanide instead of painkillers. This confirmed that the poisoner was active in King County, not at the manufacturing sites of either drug. The situation was unprecedented. Washington state imposed a 90-day ban on the sale of all over-the-counter capsule medications. Pharmaceutical companies affected by the ban united and offered a $300,000 reward for the capture of the poisoner. All the bottles were sent to the FBI for analysis. No fingerprints were found on any of the capsules. The perpetrator had likely thought to wear gloves. The poisoner carefully opened the packaging along the seam and cut the safety seal around the neck of the bottle. The medicinal contents of the capsules were discarded, and instead, each capsule contained 700 milligrams of cyanide. The bottles were then placed back into their packaging, which was resealed to make it appear unopened. This was noticeable in principle, but not obvious to an unsuspecting buyer. However, the white cyanide powder was mixed with tiny green crystals. The crystals turned out to be an algicide, a substance used to destroy algae in water bodies. The product was called Algae Destroyer. These were tablets that dissolved when placed in water. An FBI agent visited several pet stores in King County, showing the staff photos of people connected to Bruce and Susan. At one store, he came across a manager who confirmed that they sold such a product, but not very often. The issue was that moisture seeped into the packaging with the tablets, causing them to harden and barely dissolve in water. Therefore, the pet store usually ordered liquid algicides. However, there was one regular customer who disliked the liquid algicide, so the store kept a stock of the tablets specifically for her. The store manager pointed to the photo of the customer, a woman with long, wavy hair. He couldn't recall her name, but knew she shopped there frequently, sometimes every week. She kept several aquariums with tropical fish at home and even shared with him her dream of someday opening her own tropical fish store. The photo he pointed to was of Stella Nickel. It turned out that Stella had crushed the cyanide salts in the same bowl or mortar where she ground the algicide tablets before throwing them into the aquarium. But if that was true, she had already gotten away with murder thanks to the initial findings of the medical examiner. The case had been closed. All she had to do now was play the role of a grieving widow and stay silent. So why call the police a week later and attract attention to herself? The answer lay in one clause of Bruce's insurance policy, which investigators nearly missed. In the event of natural death, Stella would receive about $30,000. But if he died as a result of an accident, she would get another $100,000. Death from emphysema didn't suit the greedy wife at all. So when the media started reporting about the cyanide poisoning of Susan Snow a week later, Stella hurried to claim that her husband had died under similar circumstances. Bruce had signed his accident insurance policy just 6 months before his death. However, an FBI handwriting expert concluded that it was not Bruce who signed the document, but his wife. It was easy to believe because back in 1971, Stella had already gotten into trouble for forging documents. Her cousin was supposed to stay at Stella's house for a while, so Stella gave her own address to receive benefits. However, the cousin and her husband changed their plans and moved to Texas, where the husband found a job. They told Stella that the benefits would stop, but the money kept coming. Bob, Stella's ex-husband, asked her to send the money back. Instead, she found someone to forge her sister's husband's signature and started regularly receiving $119.50. The fraud was uncovered 9 months later when her cousin visited. Stella was sentenced to 6 months in prison but was released after 4 months for good behavior. Unfortunately for her, during that time, Bob started seeing a neighbor and was ready to divorce. Furious that she was so quickly replaced, Stella began blaming her husband for everything. She claimed that the document forgery was his idea and accused him of abusing her older daughter Cindy and their mutual daughter Leah, which was, of course, untrue. When Bob mentioned that he liked the curls of the daughter, Stella cut off all of Leah's hair. She even tried to flee the state with the girls. In the end, Bob gained custody of Leah and took her away. Cindy, Stella's eldest daughter, was still a teenager at the time, but Bob couldn't take her because he was not her father. So the detectives understood that Stella had no problem with fraud and was probably not a perfect mother, but that would not help prove her guilt in the murder. The search of her home and work locker yielded nothing. Among her aquarium supplies, there wasn't even any algicide. The detectives insisted that she take a lie detector test. Reluctantly, she agreed. While the polygraph test did a great favor to Paul, Susan's husband, by clearing him as a suspect, Stella was much less fortunate. The polygraph indicated that Stella was lying. The test results were not considered evidence, so she was released home. However, the news of her failed lie detector test triggered an interesting reaction. The FBI was contacted by Cindy, Stella's 26-year-old eldest daughter. The relationship between mother and daughter teetered on the edge between love and hate. Stella was a strict mother and demanded tough discipline. In 1969, she was arrested for beating her 10-year-old daughter. Soon after, the girl left her mother's home, and in 1978, 19-year-old Cindy found out she was pregnant. But her hope that the child would bring her closer to her mother faded when Stella responded to the news with, "I'm not ready to be a grandmother." However, when Cindy needed a job, her mother rushed to help and got her hired at the same airport where she worked. Some time ago, Stella began bringing up strange topics in conversation. For example, she asked how much of a forbidden substance would cause an overdose, or wondered why people hire hitmen if they could just arrange for brake failure or a car accident instead. At first, she spoke hypothetically, but soon she slipped and revealed that Bruce was the intended victim in all her scenarios. Cindy knew that her mother's family was struggling with debt and had recently received the final notice about overdue mortgage payments. She also knew how Stella regretted that her husband had stopped drinking. Suddenly, things became boring. The couple could no longer have fun together. Bruce had become a homebody, spending evenings in front of the TV, yet he turned out to be very strong-willed. No matter how much Stella tempted him, he resisted and did not return to his unhealthy habit. Cindy believed her mother was not serious and that if necessary, she would simply divorce Bruce. But when the truth about his poisoning and Stella's failed polygraph test came out, Cindy contacted the FBI. She revealed shocking details to the agents. Her mother had approached the matter seriously, visiting the library to first research poisonous plants. In particular, she became interested in foxglove, a pretty but poisonous plant that could be easily found right near the Nickel family home. 6 months before Bruce's death, Stella collected foxglove seeds and added them to a capsule she gave her husband. The plan was clever. Bruce liked to occasionally chew on plants growing near the house. If he had been poisoned this way, everyone would have thought he ate something on his own. But Bruce complained to colleagues about stomach pain and weakness, then quickly recovered. Stella was upset that her plan had failed. The detectives hurried to the library and seized the books Stella had borrowed. Among them was a book with a telling title, Deadly Harvest, an encyclopedia of poisonous plants. She had also read about other poisons, especially cyanide. The police established this thanks to her fingerprints found all over the pages. These pieces of evidence, along with Cindy's testimony, were enough to press charges of product tampering, including 2 cases that led to death. The trial began in April 1988. Cindy became the key witness for the prosecution. She testified that she and her mother shared a locker at work. A few days before her stepfather's death, Cindy saw capsules in a container with white powder in the locker. She thought it was salt or sugar, but her mother never used it for food. After the man's death, both the container and capsules disappeared. Stella continued to deny everything. She claimed she read the books to learn about poisonous plants because she often babysat her granddaughter. She insisted her daughter had simply lied, motivated by the $300,000 reward offered by pharmaceutical companies. While she might have been partly right about Cindy's motive, it did not diminish the importance of her testimony. Cindy might have saved her stepfather's life if she had warned him or acted sooner. But now her testimony allowed investigators to connect all the events into a single story. After her husband's death, Stella faced an unpleasant surprise when the pathologist ruled Bruce's death natural. She couldn't directly tell him to keep looking for the cause, so she decided to recreate the infamous Chicago tragedy, planting bottles with poison in various stores like some sort of pharmaceutical terrorist, and waited. After Susan Snow's death, Stella had a reason to request a review of her husband's case. If Stella's motive had been to kill her husband, she would have committed the perfect crime. But her real motive was money, and she drew attention to herself. Her plan unraveled due to mistakes she made along the way. She confessed everything to her daughter, researched poisons in the library, and crushed cyanide in the same mortar as the algae treatment. But her biggest blunder was poisoning both bottles of Excedrin that she kept at home. Out of 15,000 recalled Excedrin packages, only 4 were found to contain poison, and Stella supposedly managed to buy 2 of them from different stores 2 weeks apart. The odds of that were negligible, and this was the final nail in her coffin. After 5 days of deliberation, on May 9th, the jury found Stella guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive 90-year terms for product tampering that led to death, and 3 10-year terms for other tampering offenses. If she is not released early, she will be freed in 2040 at the age of 96. Investigators knew how lucky they were that cyanide was discovered during Susan's autopsy, which led to the product recall. Many more people could have died otherwise. Stella would have had no choice but to keep killing again and again, waiting for another victim, and then another. She would have continued playing the role of the grieving widow, all the while knowing that the remaining bottles of poison sat on store shelves, waiting to take the life of yet another innocent victim. Valley Center is a quiet suburb of Wichita, Kansas. But on November 15, 2013, at 7:17 p.m., the usual silence was shattered by the sirens of emergency service vehicles rushing to help a couple who had been attacked right in their driveway. It was their son who called for an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, they were met by a teenager waiting near his parents' car. He introduced himself as Chris Blum. Inside the vehicle, his parents, Roger and Melissa Blum, were fighting for their lives. Both had been shot in the head. Melissa was hit behind her right ear and Roger below his right eye. Based on the trajectory of the shots, the shooter had approached the victims from the passenger side. The injured couple was immediately rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought to save them. Melissa's condition was extremely critical. Roger's brain had suffered slightly less damage, but he was placed into a medically induced coma. The police searched the house and the surrounding area to ensure the killer had fled. After that, they questioned Chris about what he knew. The 16-year-old teenager said he was a wrestler and had been at a team meeting at school. He arrived home around 9 p.m. and parked his car behind his parents' vehicle. Chris saw his parents inside but didn't think much of it. Since his father loved to joke around, he assumed they were either playing a prank on him or just talking. At the time, he was also on the phone with his girlfriend. After 15-20 minutes, Chris ended the call and walked over to his parents' car. Only then did he realize something was wrong. They were covered in blood and making gurgling sounds, completely unresponsive. He immediately called 911. During the emergency call, and even now, Chris showed no emotion, as if what had happened wasn't real or didn't involve his parents. Detectives noted that this was unusual for a 16-year-old boy, but they didn't dwell on it. Officers took Chris to the station, while forensic investigators began processing the crime scene. Under the basketball hoop in the driveway, investigators found a set of keys and a phone. The keys belonged to the car, and the phone was Roger's. However, Melissa's purse and phone were missing. Since the couple was found inside their car parked in front of the house, with the headlights still on and the doors open, it was clear that they had been attacked the moment they arrived home and tried to get out of the vehicle. Forensic experts discovered 25 caliber shell casings, one lying on the ground near the passenger side and another on the dashboard. After finishing their examination of the driveway, investigators entered the house to search for additional evidence. They immediately noticed signs of a break-in. Someone had forced open the door leading from the garage into the house. Drawers and cabinets had been ransacked. At first glance, all the evidence suggested that a burglar had broken into the home, but the couple arrived earlier than expected, and the intruder killed them. However, despite how convincing this scenario seemed, it left detectives puzzled. In Kansas, the death penalty is a possible sentence for the cold-blooded murder of two people. Why would a burglar, who likely only wanted to steal valuables, shoot the couple before they even got out of their car? He had plenty of time and opportunity to flee. Even if he had come face-to-face with them, detectives began to suspect that the burglary had been staged and started digging into everything they could learn about the couple and their lives. Roger and Melissa met many years ago, and the moment Roger saw Melissa, he told his friend that she was the woman he would marry. He wasn't wrong. Both had successful careers. Roger sold heavy machinery, while Melissa was a vice president at a bank. They were known for being kind and cheerful. Roger always had a funny story or a joke ready, and Melissa was deeply loved by her friends and colleagues for her warm and caring nature. Their marriage was filled with love, trust, and support. The only sorrow in their lives was their inability to have children. But instead of letting it divide them, they made a decision to adopt. Through an adoption agency, they found two little boys, Anthony and Christopher, biological brothers. Melissa often shared with her friends how the boys' early years had been a nightmare. Their biological mother was a drug user, and their father and the mother's boyfriends often mistreated them. For a time, the boys were even homeless, and their mother couldn't provide the life they deserved. Wanting to give them a better future, Melissa and Roger chose to adopt them, offering the boys a loving home and a fresh start in life. The process of adopting siblings is never easy, but in 2001, the Blumel family welcomed two sons, 6-year-old Tony and 4-year-old Chris. Since the adoption happened later in their childhood, the boys, especially the older one, fully understood what was happening. However, they adjusted well. Roger and Melissa devoted time, attention, and effort to their children, and the boys thrived. They excelled in school, traveled frequently, and were active in sports. Both took up wrestling, with Tony even placing second in a regional tournament. They were an ordinary American family, and they were happy. After finishing their work at the crime scene, investigators were finally able to speak with witnesses, starting with Chris. His behavior puzzled detectives. He showed no emotion at all. However, they considered that he might be in shock. Additionally, having experienced trauma at the age of 4, he could have developed a defense mechanism, emotionally shutting down as if the events weren't happening to him. Regardless, the teen was already waiting at the station. Officers read him his rights. Chris confirmed that he understood everything, and then he refused to speak without a lawyer. Once again, detectives found his decision strange and wondered why he didn't want to cooperate. However, in reality, this was the best advice anyone guilty or innocent could receive, and by itself, it was not evidence of wrongdoing. However, the fact that investigators could no longer question Chris didn't mean they couldn't verify his alibi based on what he had already said. He claimed he had been at a wrestling team meeting at school with other students. This was true. He arrived at 6:30 p.m. and left around 9 p.m. He also stated that he drove home while talking to his girlfriend on the phone and called 911 at 9:17 p.m. Phone records confirmed this, as did his girlfriend. Detectives understood that it was virtually impossible to shoot his parents while casually chatting on the phone. Such an act would require superhuman abilities. So they had no doubt that Chris was not the shooter. But could they completely rule him out as a suspect? The answer to this question could have been tried to obtain from other relatives of Roger and Melissa. However, Melissa's brother confidently stated that the only person who had problems with the couple was their older son Roger and Melissa's son, Tony Bloom. The first years after the adoption went perfectly, the boy adapted wonderfully. But by the time he reached adolescence, his behavior changed drastically. In high school, he got involved with drugs and joined a bad company. Roger and Melissa tried to reason with their son, convincing him that such behavior would lead to no good, but the talks led to nothing. In June 2013, he was arrested on charges of assault. The following month, he was charged with driving under the influence. Tony had dreamed of serving in the U.S. Air Force, but after 2 arrests, these dreams were at risk. But he didn't change. The teenager didn't recognize authority, didn't want to listen to anyone, and since he practiced wrestling, he didn't hesitate to use the skills he had learned, and he was much stronger than his father, or especially his mother. Melissa began to openly fear her son. The parents didn't know what to expect from him. At the same time, their younger son lived at home with whom they had no problems, and as parents, they felt they had to protect him from the bad influence of his brother. Therefore, in the summer of 2013, they made a very difficult decision and asked their son to move out of the house. He left the state for a while, but recently returned to the city and settled in a motel. And on the very evening of the attack on Roger and Melissa, he asked his parents to have dinner with him and also to bring him some things that were still at home. Melissa admitted to her friends at work that she didn't know what to expect from her son and was nervous, but she and her husband agreed to go to dinner. Naturally, after learning such interesting details, the detectives wanted to know how the dinner went and if the parents had argued with their son again. But before they found Tony, he appeared at the hospital to inquire about his parents' condition. He said that he was at the motel when his relatives and friends started calling him, informing him that his parents had been shot. The young man was open and willing to speak with the police, but he couldn't provide any important information. The dinner with his parents went normally. They didn't argue, and they dropped him off at the motel around 8 p.m. They went home and he went to his room, and that was all he could tell. The restaurant confirmed that the couple had met with their son, and the surveillance cameras at the motel showed that Tony returned to his room around 8 in the evening and did not leave again. It seemed that the only person who had conflicts with the victims couldn't have been the shooter, unless someone else did it for him. The next day, tragic news came. Melissa passed away, and now this case was officially classified as a murder. The officers interviewed the neighbors of the family in the Valley Center suburb, hoping that someone had seen or heard something unusual. One of the neighbors hadn't seen anything personally, but suggested that a video camera had been installed on his house. The officers reviewed the video and saw a car that drove by and stopped just past the family's house. The car's lights turned off, but after a while, two beams of light appeared in the dark, leading to the family's house. It was clear that these were flashlights. Quite a bit of time passed before the couple arrived, and just a few minutes later, another car quickly drove away. This video provided the detectives with a lot of new information. First, they now knew the exact time of the attack on Melissa and Roger, 8:15 p.m. Secondly, they knew that there were two individuals involved. They also confirmed that Chris arrived at the house much later, and he was nowhere near the house when his parents were attacked. Now the detectives could answer the questions that had been before them. This couldn't have been a random robbery. Someone was specifically targeting the husband and wife. Whoever the killer was, those two had arrived long before the couple, and they had enough time for the robbery. This meant they had planned everything and were waiting for the Blums to appear, but their identities and motives remained unknown. Therefore, the police had no leads. Fortunately, there is always someone who knows something. A young man approached the police, claiming that he might have information about the murder. He only identified himself as Dalton. Dalton shared that despite his youth, he had already broken the law by dealing weapons and had even served time in prison. He had no intention of going back there, so he was trying to take control of his life and avoid breaking the law. He no longer dealt in weapons, but a couple of days before the attack on the Blums, he received a message from his school friend, 18-year-old Braden Smith. Braden wrote that he needed a weapon for work. From the message, Dalton understood that the so-called work was going to be carried out by Braden and Tony's mom. Dalton and Braden were friends with Tony Blumel in school. He wasn't sure if they were referring to that Tony, but the coincidence was disturbing. Dalton, of course, did not find a weapon for Braden. However, he had seen news about the attack on Roger and Melissa and decided to report this information to the police. It could have been a different Tony, but the officers were obligated to investigate rather than rely on assumptions. Thanks to the message, Dalton had Braden's phone number. The police called him, and he agreed to come to the station and answer questions. They asked him about the message and what it meant. The young man tried to act as if he knew nothing, but he wasn't an experienced criminal. As soon as they pressured him, he confessed everything. The Tony mentioned in the message was Tony Blum. Braden explained that Tony had often argued with his adoptive parents, but the plan to kill them only started to form after the young man was kicked out of the house in August 2013 and went to live with his biological mother, Keisha Shaberg. Many years ago, when Keisha gave up her children, she insisted on open adoption so that she could periodically see her sons. According to some studies, this type of adoption is much more beneficial for the children, especially for children age 6, who can already understand what is happening. However, Keisha's proposal was rejected. About 5-6 years after the adoption, Keisha contacted Roger and Melissa. She insisted on seeing her sons, but the couple refused. Then, in 2012, when Tony was 17 years old, Keisha found him on social media. Tony was happy because he remembered and missed his biological mother. The woman also tried to contact the younger son, Chris, but he did not want to communicate with her. Braden shared that Tony had always wanted to reunite with Keisha. His adoptive mother, Melissa, did not forbid it. She simply said, "This probably wouldn't be the best decision for you, but I can't stop you." After Tony was kicked out of the house, Braden and Tony went to California, where Keisha lived. Tony tried to convince his brother to return to their biological mother as well, but Chris clearly stated that he did not want to be involved in it. So in August 2013, Braden and Tony went to live with Keisha and settled with her, her 7-year-old daughter, and Keisha's girlfriend. Tony was upset and felt it was unfair that he had been kicked out of the house. Keisha, on the other hand, hated the Blommels because she believed they had turned her sons against her and prevented Chris from seeing her. This wasn't true, as Chris himself didn't want to communicate with her, but Keisha could not be convinced otherwise. However, no one tried to change her mind. Keisha and Tony fueled each other's hatred for Roger and Melissa. Keisha told her son what he wanted to hear, that she was his real mother, she would never have kicked him out, and that they had both become victims of the Bloms. This continued for several weeks while they all lived together in a small one-bedroom apartment. Apart from Keisha's girlfriend, no one in the group worked. They constantly used illegal substances and did nothing else. Eventually, Keisha's girlfriend grew tired of it. Not only was she fully supporting Keisha and her young daughter, but now Keisha had invited her son and his friend to stay as well. Unable to take it any longer, she kicked everyone out. The entire group decided to return to Kansas. None of them had housing, money, or jobs. However, Tony and Braden tried to make money by becoming dealers, but they weren't very successful. They were robbed a couple of times, not to mention the fact that they were smoking their own product, which didn't help their business. Despite these grim prospects, Keisha kept telling her son how much she wanted her family to reunite. Her obviously clouded mind came up with some crazy idea that they could leave and start a new life together. Tony, Braden, and Keisha. In her wildest dreams, Chris was supposed to join them. There was a fleeting thought about how nice it would be if the Blommels disappeared, because then they could make that dream come true and have money. After all, Tony was sure he was in the will and would inherit a large sum of money after his adoptive parents died. Overall, Tony wanted money, while Keisha wanted revenge. What Braden wanted was unclear, and poor Keisha's 7-year-old daughter just wanted to stay with Keisha's girlfriend, Sean Hamilton. But Tony convinced Keisha to bring the child along, telling her that he knew what it was like to live without a mother. The entire group returned to Wichita on November 1st. They all settled in a hotel room together. The accomplices had 2 weeks to plan the crime. It was crucial for them to find a time for the attack when Chris wouldn't be able to interfere, and when he would have an alibi. By checking the school schedule, Tony and his mother figured out when Chris would be occupied. Tony then asked his adoptive parents to have dinner with him that very evening. While he distracted Roger and Melissa, Braden and Keisha would stage a robbery at the family home. Then they would wait for the couple to return in order to kill them. The morning of the planned attack, Braden changed his mind about helping his mother and son. However, the accomplices couldn't carry out the attack without him, primarily because Braden had the car. So he decided he needed to find a replacement. He reached out to Andrew Ellington, known to everyone as Drew. The 18-year-old was another friend of Tony and Braden from school. Drew would constantly talk about his dream of becoming a hired killer. When Keisha offered him $1,000 to kill Roger and Melissa, he agreed without hesitation. Most likely, he would have done it for free. On November 15, 2013, Drew and Keisha parked the car a little further from the Blames' house. They approached the house on foot, lighting their way with flashlights, broke the door leading from the garage into the house, and staged a robbery. Then they hid in the bushes, waiting. It took a long time, but they waited it out. Eventually, the husband and wife arrived, having spent the evening with their son. They were likely in a good mood, happy that their relationship with Tony seemed to be improving, and completely unsuspecting of what was about to happen. Drew entered from the driver's side while Keisha entered from the passenger side. Keisha immediately shot Melissa. Drew, however, hesitated. Boasting about wanting to be a serial killer was far different from actually shooting someone. The hesitation almost gave Roger a chance to react, but he was much more concerned with Melissa's condition. He leaned over her, trying to help and asking how she was, although, of course, Melissa couldn't respond. When Keisha saw that her accomplice wasn't moving quickly enough, she aimed the gun at Roger and shot him. The killers then took Melissa's purse, phone, and a few other items from the car to make the scene look like a robbery before fleeing the scene. Keisha ordered Drew to get rid of the weapon. He found a nearby pond and disposed of all the evidence there. Braden Smith finished his statement and stood up, ready to leave. He truly believed that since he hadn't shot the victims, there was nothing to accuse him of. The detectives explained that he would soon be home. The police arrested him and the other accomplices. All 4 were charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder, as well as robbery with aggravating circumstances and theft. Drew didn't hide anything and showed them where he had thrown Melissa's purse and the weapon. Divers recovered the items from the pond. With the confessions and evidence in hand, the police turned their attention to Tony. Tony broke down in tears, but his sorrow wasn't for his adoptive parents. He felt sorry for Keisha. He continued to harbor anger toward Roger and Melissa and idealized his biological mother. As the teenagers were confessing one by one, communicating with Keisha turned out to be not so easy. She acted aggressively towards the police and denied everything. The police decided to use Tony as leverage against her. Mother and son were brought into the same interrogation room. Tony started crying. He admitted that he had confessed. His mother simply looked at him with a confused expression. It was as if she was rejecting him again, and this had a strong impact on Tony. He cried, asked for her forgiveness, begged her to say that she still loved him, and lamented that he would never be able to hug his mother again. In December 2013, 5 weeks after the attack, Roger passed away, following his beloved wife. Now the accomplices were facing the death penalty. Keisha continued to insist on her innocence, but was clearly scared of the execution. She made a peculiar deal. She did not admit her guilt, but acknowledged that she could be punished for the crime. She and her son Tony would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Braden pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 24.5 years in prison. Drew was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. It's hard to understand how Keisha could reconcile her desire to reunite with her children while persuading her biological son to commit murder, risking leaving her 7-year-old daughter without a mother and a brother in case of arrest. And that's exactly what happened. This was yet another victim of this inhuman and senseless crime. If Keisha truly wanted to be a mother, she had a daughter who needed her. After the mother's arrest, the girl was taken into foster care. Keisha's girlfriend, Sean Hamilton, promised to fight for the child to have her custody. As for Chris, he was horrified by the murder of his parents and severed all ties with his brother and biological mother. Tony tried to contact him, but Chris sent a message through the detective saying that he did not want to know them. He stated that Tony was no longer his brother. Chris grew up to be a wonderful person. He has a family and children. Roger and Melissa would have certainly loved to be grandparents and spoil their grandchildren. Their son is living the life his parents had always hoped to give him. Spring had begun in New York, though only on the calendar. On March 2, 2000, the weather was quite chilly, and by evening the thermometer had dropped even lower. Karen Mayo prepared a hot dinner and was waiting for her children to return from the babysitter at any moment. Suddenly, Karen heard loud footsteps pounding up the stairs, followed by frantic knocking at the door. She opened it. Standing there were her 6-year-old daughter and her 13-year-old brother. As soon as their mother opened the door, they burst inside and the girl screamed, "Mommy! Mommy! Someone's dead!" The children said they were coming home after spending the evening with the babysitter. They walked up to the elevator to go to the second floor. But when the elevator doors opened, the brother and sister were horrified to see a woman lying on the floor in a pool of blood. The walls and ceiling were also spattered with bright red blood. Terrified, the children ran home up the stairs. At 9:30 p.m. on March 2, 2000, a call came into the police reporting that a woman's body had been found in an apartment building in the Bronx. The police rushed to the scene. The victim was a young, beautiful brunette, likely of Hispanic descent. She was wearing a coat and sweatpants, giving the impression that she had intended to step out of the house for just a moment. The victim had been shot in the head with a handgun, causing bits of her brain and long strands of hair to stick to the elevator ceiling. A 9mm shell casing lay on the floor next to the body, explaining the force with which her brain had been blown apart. But this was not the only gunshot wound. She had also been shot in the chest. In addition, she had been stabbed multiple times, and her throat had been cut deeply from ear to ear. This was unusual. Typically, police see only one type of injury on victims, either gunshot or stab wounds. Why would someone shoot a victim and then take a knife to her body after she was already clearly dead? This immediately led investigators to suspect that there had been at least 2 attackers. To advance the investigation, the detectives needed to establish the victim's identity. They went door to door in the apartment building. First, they hoped to find the apartment where the deceased had lived. Second, they needed to interview the residents to see if anyone had seen or heard anything, perhaps a stranger entering or leaving the building. After all, in 2000, there weren't nearly as many security cameras in and around buildings as there are today. Eventually, they knocked on the door of 39-year-old Chanel Chandler. When they showed her a photo of the victim from the elevator, Chanel broke down in hysterics because the deceased was her friend. Chanel identified the victim as 39-year-old Evelyn Santos Ortiz. Chanel explained that she and her friend had lived in neighboring apartments, That evening, they were sitting and relaxing when Evelyn said she would like another beer. Chanel gave her friend $10 and returned to her own apartment, while Evelyn put on her jacket and went out. Chanel peeked out the window but didn't see Evelyn leave. She did hear some banging sounds, but assumed it was just the trash chute. Within minutes, someone in the hallway shouted that there was a body in the elevator. The police arrived soon after. Everything had happened so quickly that Chanel could hardly believe her friend was gone and that her children were now without a mother. The thought hit her like an electric shock. She completely forgot about Evelyn's children, Anthony and Teresa Ortiz. Anthony was usually traveling, and on the day of his mother's murder, he was out of town. 14-year-old Teresa, however, was very close to her mother and had stayed home. She was looking after her little cousin, Gabby. The police faced the difficult task of telling the girl that her mother was dead. As expected, Teresa broke down in hysterics, repeating over and over, "I need my mom. I want my mom." What had happened made no sense to her. Her mother had said she'd step out briefly. Teresa had been waiting, thinking her mom would return any minute, but she never would. Both girls, 14-year-old Teresa and 4-year-old Gabby, were taken to the police station. The police were required to inform Gabby's parents, Gabriel Aguilar, of their daughter's whereabouts. They first tried to contact Evelyn's sister, Denise Santos, or her boyfriend, Irvin Aguilar, but neither answered their calls. When that failed, the officers began reaching out to other family members. Evelyn was born into a very large Puerto Rican family. Her parents were Lucia Santos and Ismael Santos. 39 years ago, they had their daughter Evelyn, who was the eldest child in the family. Soon after, Irma and Eduardo Santos were born, and finally Denise. Thus, Denise was Evelyn's youngest sister. Denise lived with Irvin Aguilar. Although they had been living together for a long time and had a daughter, Gabby, they were never officially married. All the members of the large Santos family lived literally within a few blocks of each other and shared close, loving relationships. So when they were informed of Evelyn's brutal murder, they were horrified. They could not accept the news that Evelyn was gone. She had been a wonderful person, and anyone who had even briefly known her would agree. While officers continued trying to reach little Gabby's parents, the detectives focused on understanding how the murder had occurred. Evelyn was attacked near the elevator as it descended to the first floor. She had planned a quick trip to the store and intended to return home. She was calm and relaxed, but when the elevator doors opened, Evelyn came face to face with her killer or killers. Without giving her a chance to react, the assailant pressed a gun to her chin and shot her. Evelyn fell dead, but the criminals were not finished. They shot her in the chest, slashed her throat with a knife, and struck her 3 more times. However, during these final blows, no blood spattered because her heart had already stopped. In other words, it was clear that most of the shootings and stabbings were inflicted post-mortem. There was no practical need for this. It spoke to the killer's rage. The attack was clearly personal. Evelyn's body was still warm, above 36 degrees Celsius. Rigor mortis had not yet set in, indicating that she had been attacked less than an hour earlier. By this time, the police had contacted 6 members of the Santos family. However, they still could not locate Evelyn's sister Denise or Denise's boyfriend Irvin. Meanwhile, the clock hands passed 3 in the morning, and it was strange that the parents had shown no concern for their 4-year-old daughter, had not come to pick her up, and had not tried to reach Evelyn or Teresa. The officers decided to drive over to Denise and Irvin's house. It was 5:15 a.m., 8 hours after Evelyn's murder, when the police arrived at the spacious 2-story brick home. No lights were on, and the front door was locked. At first glance, it seemed as if the family were asleep, but the officers could hear the family's dogs barking loudly. The barking was coming from the basement, and the dogs seemed completely frantic. Naturally, this struck the police as strange. Why would dogs be howling like that at 5 in the morning in a dark house? One of the detectives found a bucket, flipped it over, stood on top, and peered through a window. To his horror, he saw a body inside. Firefighters were called to break down the door, allowing the detectives to enter the house. On the floor lay the body of a young dark-haired woman, surrounded by a pool of blood. A large kitchen knife protruded from her neck. Armed detectives searched the house room by room, while the dogs continued barking frantically from the basement. The state of the house suggested it had been ransacked. Clothes were scattered everywhere, cabinets were left open, and there was a hole in the wall, apparently where a large safe had once stood and had been removed. On the kitchen table, the detectives found an ID card belonging to the victim. They realized it was 30-year-old Denise Santos, Evelyn's youngest sister. Denise's body told a story of the attack that was somewhat different from her older sister's. There were no gunshot wounds at all. She lay on the floor with her head turned to the side, and someone had struck her with such force that the knife went completely through her neck and embedded itself in the wooden floor, literally pinning her to the ground. Before this, the killer had inflicted about 15 stab wounds. Could this have been a message of sorts? A demonstration of the killer's rage? Piercing a neck all the way through is not easy. Especially if the victim is alive, they would struggle, move, try to push away. Investigators concluded that when Denise was pinned to the floor, she was already dead. This was yet another murder in which the perpetrator or perpetrators clearly went overboard, continuing to stab the victim long after it was unnecessary. Because Denise's body had begun to stiffen, the medical examiner estimated that she had been killed about 10 hours earlier. She had definitively died before her older sister. The detectives didn't know what to make of it. Two sisters had been killed just a few blocks apart, only hours apart, and it seemed that one of their homes had been ransacked. The investigators were confident they would find a connection between the crimes, but first, they decided it was important to locate the rest of the Santos family. They still had not reached Irvin, Denise's boyfriend, and they hadn't found Eduardo, the brother of Denise and Evelyn. Eduardo lived not far from his sisters, so the detectives decided to pay him a visit. In the parking lot, they noticed a blue Mercedes-Benz with a small Puerto Rican flag hanging from the rearview mirror. As well as a handicapped placard, Eduardo had health issues and walked with a limp. Hoping to find him at home, the detectives went up to his apartment. They immediately noticed that the door was unlocked, but it wouldn't open fully because on the other side was another body. 9 hours after Evelyn's death, and just an hour after Denise's body was discovered, the police came across yet another crime scene involving members of the Santos family. At 7:30 a.m., when they were able to enter the apartment of 34-year-old Eduardo, they found an absolute bloodbath. Blocking the door was the body of 34-year-old Irvin Aguilar, Denise's boyfriend and little Gabby's father. He lay face down on the floor, a knife protruding from his neck, just as it had from his girlfriend's. In addition, he had been stabbed 16 times and shot 3 times, once in the chest and twice in the head. Less than a meter away from Irvin in the hallway lay the body of the second victim, 34-year-old Eduardo Santos. He had a single gunshot wound to the head. He had not been stabbed, his throat was not cut, and he had not been pinned to the floor. It was clear that Irvin had been killed in an indescribable rage, while Eduardo had been shot just once. Of course, both were dead in the end, but the police concluded that Irvin's murder was personal, whereas Eduardo had become a collateral victim. But that wasn't all. The detectives noticed bloody footprints leading into the bedroom. From there came some sounds. At first, they thought music was playing, but it turned out to be cartoons. In the bedroom awaited the youngest victim of this horrific case. On the bed, face down, lay 14-year-old Ishmael Santos, the nephew of Denise, Eduardo, and Evelyn. All three had essentially raised him, and he lived with Eduardo. He still had his school backpack on, decorated with SpongeBob SquarePants. It appeared that the boy had come home from school, entered the bedroom, turned on the TV, and was about to take off his backpack when the killer struck. The bullet entered the left side of his head and exited through the right, passing through his hand. It seemed that Ishmael had heard the earlier shots and, in terror, pressed his hands to his ears to block out the nightmare, realizing he might be next. That's why the bullet went through his hand. The scene in Eduardo's apartment was horrific and indescribable. Blood was everywhere, already starting to dry. It was clear that the attack on the 3 family members had occurred several hours earlier. The intruders had clearly ransacked the apartment. The detectives didn't know whether they had been looking for jewelry, money, or illegal substances. Spent shell casings were scattered on the floor, which were sent for comparison with the casings found at Evelyn's crime scene. The bullets might have been fired from the same weapon. It didn't take a genius to see that all the murders were connected, but investigators didn't yet know how. There had to be a reason why this family became the killer's target. Within 24 hours, 5 people had been murdered. The police compared evidence from all 3 crime scenes. The temperature of the bodies and the state of rigor mortis indicated that the 3 victims in Eduardo's apartment had died first, between 8 and 12 hours earlier. Then the killer, or most likely killers, went to Denise's house. Finally, Evelyn Santos was killed. It was only a short time before the neighbor children discovered her. She had been the last to be murdered, but the first to be found. Why the victims had been killed in this particular order and who had been the primary target remained a mystery. The police turned to the public for help, offering a $10,000 reward for any information that could assist in solving the case. Of course, the police were not just hoping for outside help, they were working diligently to solve the case. They examined the backgrounds of Evelyn, Denise, and Eduardo, but found nothing illegal. They had steady jobs and were raising children responsibly. Irvin, however, had a criminal past related to illegal substances, and it was serious. He had served time for a federal offense. This was not about a small possession of marijuana, but involved kilograms of drugs. Naturally, as the police began piecing the puzzle together, they wondered whether Irvin, the only family member with a criminal history, might have been the primary target of the attack, especially considering how brutally he had been killed. Could someone from his past have wanted revenge over money or a product? The family quickly reassured the police that when Irvin got out of prison, he had left that life behind and devoted himself fully to Denise, Gabby, and their future together. But the detectives had to verify this. They tried to trace any of Irvin's current connections in the criminal world, but found only old acquaintances who insisted they had had no dealings with him for years. Furthermore, in Eduardo's apartment, where Irvin's body was found, and in the home he shared with Denise, the police found no trace of drugs or items related to their use. Overall, there was no evidence that the crime had anything to do with illegal substances. Investigators concluded that the family had been right. Irvin had turned over a new leaf and dedicated himself entirely to his family. The police spoke again with all members of the Santos family, paying particular attention to re-interviewing 14-year-old Teresa, Evelyn's daughter, to see if she knew who her mother might have spoken with that day. The girl explained that when she returned from school, her mother had said she had accidentally run into her ex-boyfriend on the street, someone she thought was living in Florida. The man had promised to stop by and take her out to dinner. Teresa didn't know his name, but other family members told the police that Evelyn's ex-boyfriend, who lived in Florida, was named Luis Garcia. They had dated for about a year, 5 years earlier. After their breakup, they had remained friends and not just with Evelyn. Luis had also become friends with her brother Eduardo and often visited their home. The police became interested in Luis, and while officers began searching for him, they continued digging into the victim's past and made a discovery that could change the entire course of the investigation. Investigators discovered that Eduardo had received a very large sum of money. He had suffered a brain injury, and the hospital had provided poor care, so he filed a lawsuit. The hospital agreed to settle before the case went to trial, and Eduardo received $3.5 million. Eduardo was known as a kind person, a loving brother and friend, always helping anyone he could. He bought a house for his sister Denise and cared for Evelyn and the rest of his family. The money he received was like winning the lottery. And as with any lottery win, the best advice is to keep it secret. But once people learned that Eduardo had money, they began asking to borrow from him. Eduardo was generous and rarely refused. Family and friends noticed that people constantly tried to take advantage of him because of his trusting nature. Perhaps someone had advised him, or he had figured it out himself, to impose at least one condition on loans. The borrower would receive the money, but would have to repay it with interest. Eduardo lent money to several people, including individuals whose names the police had already repeatedly heard. It turned out that Eduardo had lent $80,000 to Luis Garcia, the ex-boyfriend Evelyn had accidentally run into on the street the day she was killed. Luis had long been supposed to repay the full amount with interest, and Eduardo was frustrated with the debtor for continually delaying payment. Irvin, being a close friend of Eduardo, always stood up for him and defended him. Friends of Irvin told the police that earlier that week, Irvin had gotten into an argument with Luis Garcia over the money. During the confrontation, Irvin struck Luis on the head hard enough that Luis lost consciousness. By March 3, 2000, while the police were still searching for Luis, investigators did not know whether the Santos family was still in danger. When Lucia and Ismael Santos, the parents of Evelyn, Denise, and Eduardo, arrived from Puerto Rico, the police dispatched an armed team to meet them at the airport and take them to a safe location. Their children and grandson had been killed, and it was possible that the parents themselves were also targets. The police could not risk their lives. Soon the investigators made a breakthrough in the search for Luis. They had Eduardo's electronic organizer, and a family member helped them access it. Inside, the officers found Luis's address in Florida. From that point, the investigation accelerated. They had his photo and knew where he lived, but they still didn't know whether he was the one who had killed 5 people, including a child, over $80,000. And if he was, who had been his accomplice? Thanks to witness statements, they were able to link two men of Hispanic appearance to all three crime scenes. The suspects had been seen driving a sports car, either a purple Pontiac Firebird Trans Am or a Chevrolet Camaro. The police passed the vehicle description to patrol units, but the men had likely already left town. The authorities then reached out to detectives in Florida. A Miami detective went to the given address, but neither the suspect nor the car was there. The next morning, as the same detective who had visited Luis's house the day before was leaving home and getting ready to start work, a purple Pontiac Firebird Trans Am happened to park behind him. There were two men in the car. It was an interesting coincidence. The detective recognized one of the men from the photo his colleagues had sent him. It was Luis Garcia. He didn't know the second man, but both of them entered the building, then came back out and began cleaning the car inside and out. It looked like they were trying to erase evidence. The detective reported this to his colleagues, who quickly boarded a flight to Miami. Meanwhile, the men got into the car and prepared to leave. The detective had to act quickly. He decided to approach the suspects and ask Luis for his driver's license. Luis handed over his license, but didn't notice that 4 of Denise Santos's credit cards were stuck to his wallet. The detective immediately realized he was facing the killer of 5 people. Luis's accomplice was named Jose Cosme Pizarro. Jose's body bore prison tattoos, marking him as a murderer. It turned out he had served time in Puerto Rico's worst prison. Around his neck hung a thin gold chain with a ring engraved with the letter G. Irvin and Denise's daughter was named Gabby, and it was her ring, which Denise had worn around her neck. The police were correct. There had been 2 killers. The detective arrested both men. When investigators from New York arrived in Miami, they first searched Luis's apartment and found a wealth of evidence. Most notably, there was a pile of blood-stained cash, thousands of dollars. They also found shoes with soles that matched footprints left at the crime scenes of Eduardo, Irvin, and Ishmael. In addition, the apartment still contained a safe and firearms that the criminals had attempted to saw apart to prevent ballistic testing. But they had made a mistake, cutting the guns lengthwise into large pieces. Forensic experts were still able to test a bullet against those recovered from the crime scenes, and they matched perfectly. It was time to interrogate the suspects. As usual, at first the men denied everything. Luis was the first to speak, claiming that he had simply traveled to New York again when Jose Pizarro told him he had kilograms of illegal substances for sale, and that Jose was the one who had killed the family. Jose in turn claimed that he had stayed in the car while Luis carried out the murders. Despite their denials, the police were certain that the killings had been committed together. One clearly used knives, the other a firearm. The men were arrested and extradited to New York. In reality, the entire story revolved around one thing. Luis did not want to repay Eduardo's debt. He knew there was a large amount of money in Eduardo's home, so he enlisted his friend Jose to break into the apartment and steal it. He did not care how many people would die in the process. The accomplices killed Eduardo, the accidental witness Ishmael, and Irvin, especially taking out their rage on Irvin for having struck Luis a few days earlier. Luis and Jose then ransacked the apartment, took all the money they could find, and drove to Denise's house. Were they trying to silence a witness, or were they after the safe that had been removed from the wall? Most likely it was the latter. After that, they wasted no time and went to Evelyn's home. Her chance encounter with Luis on the street that day had sealed her fate. She had witnessed something and in their minds, had to die. The trial took place in January 2003, 3 years after the tragic deaths of the 5 members of the Santos family. Luis Garcia was convicted of first-degree murder. Jose Cosme Pizarro was convicted of 3 counts of second-degree murder. Both are now serving life sentences. This story began on November 10, 2000 in New York, when police officers pulled a body out of the East River that had been stuffed into 3 laundry bags. The police received a call from a witness who thought he had spotted a body floating in the water, and the Marine police were sent to search for it. Finding the body was difficult because of the river's strong current. The search was further complicated by windy weather. The divers who entered the water could not see beyond the tips of their noses and had to move almost entirely by feel. Currents were pushing against them from 2 different directions, which was extremely dangerous. For that reason, the police dispatched a helicopter. Near the promenade, they spotted the body, and it was pulled from the water. The man's body turned out to be wrapped in 3 canvas bags like the kind used for dirty laundry. One was pulled over his head, The second was tightly wrapped around his torso, and the third was placed over his legs. It was perfectly obvious that this was a victim of murder. Otherwise, why wrap him in bags and throw him into the river? The medical examiner carefully opened the top bag and saw the man's face. It appeared that he was slightly over 50, but that was all that could be said because the body was badly decomposed. A fabric belt, likely from a coat, was wrapped around the man's neck, and it had left a deep groove, indicating that the victim had been strangled. It is a horrific way to die. The final moments of his life were agonizing. Investigators immediately noticed one unusual detail. The victim's body had been decomposing for 5 to 7 days. However, if he had been strangled and then immediately thrown into the river, there would have been signs of decomposition in water, corresponding marks on the skin. After all, bodies decompose differently in cold water than they do in a dry, warm environment. The medical examiner concluded that the body had been in the water for about 2 days. This meant that the man had been killed approximately a week earlier and only then thrown into the river, after which the body surfaced. In other words, the body had been hidden or kept somewhere for about 5 days. The body was taken to the morgue for an autopsy. When the medical examiner carefully removed the bags, he saw the body of a man wearing a white shirt and pajama bottoms. He was barefoot. The man was dressed very much as one would be at home, and accordingly, he had no documents or wallet on him. The police immediately realized that they would have to work hard to determine who this man was. However, there was a ring on his ring finger. This allowed 2 conclusions to be drawn right away. First, the deceased was married. Second, the theory of a robbery gone wrong could be ruled out. The autopsy confirmed that the man died as a result of asphyxiation. Murders of this kind are usually very personal, as they reveal the depth of rage in which the killer was acting. This meant that the deceased most likely knew his attacker. It was impossible to determine the exact time of death, but the medical examiner confirmed the initial assumption that the body had been decomposing in a warm environment for 5-7 days before it was thrown into the river. During the autopsy, a DNA sample was taken from the man, both to determine at least his race and for later identification. DNA analysis showed that the man was of Asian appearance. From there, the police pursued several different avenues to identify the body of the man pulled from the East River. First, they ran the victim's fingerprints through their databases, but found nothing. Then they contacted the missing persons unit in case someone matched the man's description. Again, nothing turned up. However, there was a label on the man's clothing with writing in Chinese. Officers went to Chinatown, hoping someone might recognize the label or tell them whether such items were sold there or imported from China. Unfortunately, this too led to disappointment. They still did not know who the body in the morgue belonged to. Had he fallen victim to gang violence, personal animosity, envy, or jealousy? Perhaps it was a contract killing, or even the work of a serial killer. The last remaining hope was that someone would begin searching for the man. After all, the ring on his ring finger indicated that he was married, which meant that someone would surely notice his absence. In this, they turned out to be right. 5 days after the body was discovered, a young woman named Teresa contacted the missing persons unit. Her father, mother, and younger sister had gone missing. Since the woman was of Asian appearance, detectives assumed that this might be the man whose body was lying in the morgue. So as not to shock her, they first asked her to identify the man by his clothing. A white shirt and pajama bottoms. Teresa recognized the clothes as her father's. She was then taken to the morgue where she confirmed that the deceased was indeed her father. His name was Stephen Leung. However, this raised a new question. Where were her mother, 40-year-old Chilin Leung, and her 17-year-old sister, Connie Leung? The police feared that something terrible might have happened to them as well. Were they alive? Had they been kidnapped? Was the perpetrator planning to kill them too? A race against time began to find them. The detectives hurried to gather all the information they could from Teresa. She told them that her parents, Chilin and Stephen, had moved to New York from Hong Kong sometime around 1970. Her father found work as a waiter at the Meridian Hotel. Chilin worked at a Chinese restaurant. Her parents were incredibly hardworking. They worked late 7 days a week, often took extra shifts, and agreed to side jobs. Overall, they devoted themselves to giving their children the best possible opportunities in life. There were 3 children in the family. The eldest, Teresa, was already an adult and lived separately from her parents, having her own place. Her younger brother, Frederick, also known as Frederick or simply Fred, was a student. 19-year-old Fred lived with his parents. For the most part, however, he was left to his own devices since Chilin and Stephen were always at work. At the same time, he had never been a problem child. Even at 19, he seemed like a quiet, well-mannered young man. He was not the type to start fights or pick arguments. Essentially, his main passion was skateboarding, and in his free time away from university, he relaxed with friends and rode his board. As for Teresa and Fred's younger sister Connie, she was 17 years old. She was still in school and was an excellent student. She had top grades and was expected to go on to medical school. In other words, her parents' dream was close to being fulfilled. Their youngest daughter, like her older brother and sister, was meant to achieve far more in life. Teresa said that she and her mother spoke on the phone every day, but she had not heard from her mother for several days now. She also knew that 2 days earlier, on Saturday, her sister had missed a scheduled appointment. Connie had been looking for a studio apartment, but she never showed up for the meeting. Teresa became worried, called her brother, and asked where everyone had gone. He replied that he did not know. Teresa decided to contact the police and report all 3 of them missing. What immediately troubled the detectives was the fact that Fred had not been the first to raise the alarm. After all, he should have been the first to notice their absence. How could he not have wondered where they were? Investigators concluded that he might be connected to their disappearance. That meant they needed to speak with the young man and inspect the apartment where the family lived. Fred let the officers in and agreed to answer their questions. The apartment was somewhat cramped as it was filled with all kinds of belongings, but overall nothing immediately caught the officers' attention. Fred repeated what he had told Teresa. He did not know where his parents and sister were. The last person he had seen was Connie. A few days earlier, his sister had told him that their father had taken on extra hours at work and that their mother had found a side job as a nanny. After that, he had not seen anyone in the apartment, including his sister. The police did not understand why he had not told anyone about this or shared any concern, because in fact, he had not been worried about anyone at all. Fred explained that the issue was his parents' astonishing work ethic. In addition, he himself often went out, stayed overnight at friends' places, then came back and left again. Simply put, for this family, for these children, there was nothing unusual about not crossing paths with their parents for an entire week. Fred simply had no reason to assume that this time they had gone missing. Of course, the police did not take the young man at his word, but after a lengthy interrogation at the precinct and after speaking with his friends, Fred Leung was released and sent home. Since Chillin and Connie had still not been found, the police began to fear the worst. Detectives spoke with Stevens and Chillin's co-workers, as well as with neighbors, but none of them were able to help the investigation. All they knew was that the couple were good, hardworking people. Again, because of their work hours, the neighbors barely knew them and could only say that the family was very quiet. They had never heard any shouting or arguments. As looking into the parents' lives led nowhere, the detectives turned their attention to the children, and a conversation with one of Connie's friends proved far more productive. Connie had a friend who lived on the west side of Manhattan in the West Side. The young woman told the police that just a couple of days earlier, she had had lunch with Connie and her boyfriend. The detectives were relieved to hear that Connie was alive, but at the same time they were confused. The friends said that Connie and Eric were living at a different address. Officers went to the address provided by the young woman, but the couple were not there. Meanwhile, they tried to learn more about the life of the family's youngest daughter. Connie had always been a very talented, intelligent, and diligent young woman. She studied exceptionally well and had already received an acceptance offer from a medical school, a lucky opportunity that few receive. Connie was expected to become a doctor. Her parents were thrilled and closely monitored her progress to ensure she worked even harder and secured her place in medical school. But despite their efforts, like Fred, Connie was mostly left to her own devices because her parents worked so much. They missed the moment when their youngest daughter became infatuated with a young man. Whereas before she had been a model student who went straight home from school, now all her thoughts revolved around her boyfriend. Her academic performance dropped sharply, and at some point Connie began attending school less frequently, which was very uncharacteristic of her. Connie's boyfriend, Eric Louison, was 3 years older than her. He had attended the same school as she did, but a few years earlier. When the young couple began dating, Eric was neither studying nor working. Evidently, he spent his time negatively influencing Connie, who had gone from being an excellent student to skipping school. It is worth noting that her parents did not want her to be dating anyone at all. They wanted her to focus 100% on her studies. But Eric provoked a particular dislike from them. The police learned that Eric had been kicked out of his own home. Connie's older sister, Teresa, reported that Eric would often sneak into the family apartment and spend a lot of time there. The parents demanded that their daughter break up with her boyfriend, but this only caused further problems in the family. 1 or 2 days before the murder, Stephen Leung had gone to his daughter's school regarding her grades and truancy. He was very displeased with what he learned about Connie's academic performance. Overall, the situation had become quite tense, and investigators began to wonder whether Eric could be capable of killing Stephen and doing something to Chillin. He had never been arrested before and had no prior legal problems. But of course, there is a first time for everything, even for a crime. Meanwhile, the officers waited at the address provided by the friend until a 17-year-old girl and a young man appeared. The police approached, asked the young couple to identify themselves, and they said their names were Connie Leung and Eric Louison. On one hand, the investigators felt relief, seeing that Connie was alive, but at the same time they had many questions. The young couple agreed to speak with them, but it was clear that they were very nervous. The officers did not tell them that Stephen's body had been discovered. They only said that Teresa had reported her parents missing. Connie explained that her parents worked a lot and took on extra jobs, so she saw them very little. The officers asked why they had stopped at the unspecified place. The young people replied that their parents did not approve of their relationship, so they were planning to run away. During the conversation, the police realized that Connie and Eric were hiding something, and that getting answers from them while they clung to each other would be impossible. The couple was taken to the precinct and separated into different rooms for questioning. After that, the interrogation began. Connie was informed that her father's body had been found and was at the morgue, and that Teresa had identified him. The detectives asked whether Connie knew what had happened to them. She told several stories, each more fantastical than the last. According to one of them, her father had been killed by the Chinese mafia, which was extorting money from her parents. They supposedly strangled her parents as soon as they entered the apartment. Then, under threat of death, Connie and Eric were forced to carry the bodies to the water and throw them into the river. The investigators did not believe a single word of the story. Professional executions carried out by the mafia happen completely differently. They do not strangle victims with coat belts, because belts leave evidence that can lead to the killer. A mafia member, if it came to that, would simply fire a bullet and would not make the victim's daughter and her boyfriend dispose of the body. The story even sounded absurd. The detectives told Connie directly that they did not believe her story and suggested she try again, this time to tell the truth. The girl's face showed not a single emotion as she began recounting the events of the evening of November 2nd. In reality, Eric had been living with her for some time in her room in her parents' apartment. Of course, her parents had no idea. Connie had made a bed for Eric under her own. On November 2nd, she went to school, leaving Eric in the apartment in her room. That's when her father found him, and naturally Stephen was upset and angry and ordered Eric to get out of the apartment. To her father, Eric was the reason his daughter might lose her bright future, her education, and her successful medical career. If only he had known at that moment how right he would turn out to be. Eric decided to wait for Connie on the street. He wanted to intercept her before she went home and tell her that her father had seen him. While recounting this to the police, Connie added that she had been afraid her parents would hit her at home. It's worth noting that the investigators found no evidence that Stephen or Chillin had ever harmed their daughter. Connie and Eric discussed what to do next. They were choosing between running away or killing her parents. They leaned toward running away to Japan, where Eric could attend a ninja school. Under the assumption that it would straighten him out, maybe that would have been for the best. But the problem was that Eric did not have a passport. At the same time, according to Eric, he was afraid for Connie and did not want to let her go home. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, they agreed that they would have to do something about Stephen and Chillin. Connie and Eric returned to the apartment before her parents came home from work. Connie's brother was not at home. The couple began waiting for Stephen to arrive. Finally, the tired father came home, put on his pajamas, and sat in his favorite chair, resting after a long day at work. Connie entered the room to distract him. From behind, Eric approached the man with a towel that Connie had handed him. He covered the man's head with the towel and tightened it so that he could not breathe. Naturally, the man struggled for his life. Eric pushed him to the floor and shouted to Connie that he needed help. She panicked, not knowing what to do. Eric ordered her to hold her father, so she simply sat on her father's back. It is hard even to imagine the thoughts racing through the man's mind at that moment. His daughter, his little girl, the one whose life he had given and whom he loved madly, was killing him. And for what? For working tirelessly for her for days, and just yesterday going to her school worried about her future? For trying to protect her from a bad influence? Eventually, the man lost consciousness and stopped resisting, but Eric still held him down for a while. Then he told Connie that her father was dead. He ordered her to fetch a belt from her room. Eric wrapped the belt around the man's neck and tightened it to make sure he was dead. Then the accomplices hid the body behind the bed so that no one would see it upon entering the room. Around 10 o'clock, Eric ordered Connie to sit by the bed and wait for her mother to arrive. He hid behind the door. Soon, Chillin came home. She left some groceries in the kitchen and walked into the room. She saw Connie and began yelling at her, scolding her. At that moment, Eric threw a towel over her head and pushed her toward the bed. The woman resisted even more fiercely than her husband had. Eric had to sit on her, while the daughter held her mother's hands. Once Chillin stopped resisting, the killers wrapped another belt around her neck and tightened it. Connie and Eric then laid Chillin's body next to her husband's. Afterward, they showered, talked briefly, and went to sleep. Because the bodies had been in the room for several days and Fred still lived in the same apartment, the accomplices opened the bedroom windows so he would not notice the smell. The smell itself apparently did not bother them, as they had sex on the parents' bed while the father and mother lay on the floor nearby. The fact that a child is capable of killing their own parents indicates a particularly severe level of psychopathy, but continuing to live in the same apartment, next to the bodies, eating, and having sex on the parents' bed, this is almost incomprehensible. Of course, killing them was one thing, but now they had to figure out how to dispose of the bodies. 4 days later, the accomplices placed Chillin in laundry bags and then in a shopping cart. It was around 3 o'clock in the morning when they transported their heavy burden to a pedestrian bridge over the river. They walked a bit further and dumped the body into the water along with the cart. According to Connie, she did not feel remorse or cry. She simply said she was surprised that her mother's body did not sink immediately. The cart splashed on the water, and she and Eric watched it until it disappeared from view. They then returned to the apartment and fell asleep. The following day, or rather, the following night, they attempted the same procedure with Stephen. They wrapped him in bags, placed him in a shopping cart, and wheeled him to the river. At some point, the body slipped from the cart. A few days later, it was recovered from the East River. The lovers were charged with the murders of Stephen and Chillin Leung. Their motive was simple and straightforward. They wanted to continue their relationship and, for some reason, decided that murder was the only way. Yet they had clearly given no thought to what would happen afterward. After committing the murders, they still planned to run away. But where could they go if Eric truly had no passport? They had killed their parents and traded away the chance to attend medical school, their future, for a young man whose biggest ambition was to attend a ninja school in Japan. It seems that Connie was not nearly as clever as people had believed. In this story, the tragedy is not only the loss of the parents' lives, but also the suffering inflicted on Fred and Teresa. To discover that your own sister and her boyfriend strangled your mother and father, and then lived with the bodies for nearly a week, Connie and Eric destroyed an entire family. On November 19th, 3 days after their arrest, officers recovered Chillin's body from the river. She was in laundry bags and placed in a shopping cart, exactly as Eric and Connie had described. The defendants pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. They were sentenced to 30 years in prison. However, in 2021, after serving 20 years, Connie was released because she unexpectedly claimed that she had been a victim of domestic abuse by Eric. According to the court's decision, Connie Leung is prohibited from ever contacting her brother or sister. Eric continues to serve his sentence in prison.